And what I want to talk about with you on the second stream is just what, if we can think in a practical terms for a minute, what it would look like to have the kind of international socialist politics that would be necessary to truly intervene in a moment like this one. And what do you think we should be building along those lines? And so that's what we'll talk about. And for patrons, for the inside vanguardist cell that that I'm creating. All right.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Hi, Ron.
I
and
like your introduction.
Yeah, welcome to the Twitch stream that we're on now. We are also on YouTube, and we do an audio podcast. You've been on the Sublation Media YouTube channel before, and Ron and Urszula, you're both members of the News and Letters organization, which is a Marxist humanist organization. And I want to get you to start with just by describing what that is. And while you do that, I'm going to tweet out that we're streaming, and people who want to watch us can come and join us. But what is Marxist humanism? And I guess maybe I'll ask along with that, who is Raya Dunyaskaya, who is the founder of News and Letters?
I guess I'll start. Marxist humanism for me is the continuation of philosophy of liberation. Marxism is philosophy of liberation, or it's nothing. It's not an analysis of capitalism. It's not any economic discussion. It really is about what is freedom and what would it take to break from capitalism that will actually work. Raya Dunyaskaya is a revolutionary from probably the time she first breathed. She was a witness to the Russian Revolution, mostly Russian counter-revolution, actually, but grew up in Chicago. At the time, the only opposition to Stalin was Trotsky. She joined Trotsky in Mexico and broke with him when he continued to defend Stalin after Stalin made a pact with Hitler. She said, you cannot possibly support that. It's not a degenerate state anymore. She went on to make an original analysis of Russia as a state capitalist society, and eventually founded her own organization, which she called News and Letters. And she died in 1987, and we have been attempting to be a continuators of that philosophy. So philosophy doesn't exist as an academic discipline only. It exists in the actual lives of actual people. And what we're trying to do is give voice to that realm of ideas, specifically the idea of freedom that actually exists in people's lives, but usually doesn't get articulated as that. Enough of an introduction?
Yes, great. I follow-up question is, this is just based on my own curiosity here, having a history with Marxist humanism, and never quite figuring out this question while I was involved with it. And also because I'm frequently talking to another Trotskyist organization, not the people from the Platypus Affiliated Society, And yesterday, the Chris Catrone, one of the founders, told me that he was absolutely a dedicated Leninist. So I'm curious to know to what degree Raya Dostoevskaya should be thought of as a Leninist, and what the news and letters relationship is with Leninism, and maybe the question of the party. And then we can move on to the current events and your recent article, which is called this is Ron's article, Putin's brutal war in Ukraine puts the future of humanity in doubt. And that is absolutely true. But yeah, what about Leninism?
Well, the short answer is we're not Leninists.
Yeah. Right.
But the long answer is a much more complicated. Lenin was really helpful to Dostoevskaya at the end of the 1940s and the early 1950s in opening up the world of Hegel. No one had seriously gone into his philosophic notebooks. Part of that was Lenin's own fault, but it opened up a different perspective on the relationship between Marx and Hegel that Lenin went to find and reorganize himself, and the great contributions that he did make, the great breakthroughs that he did make in the Russian Revolution that were unique to him and not to Trotsky and not to especially Stalin or Bukharin, mm-hmm. that posture opened up the world of Hegel in a way that she ran with it and went into Hegel directly and created her own continuity and discontinuity with Lenin through Hegel, mm-hmm. and also a continuity with Marx that had been went beyond the way Lenin postured it. But she had a great deal of felt she owed a great deal to Lenin in her own development.
Where, if you were to look for direct people who might be curious about this to really get into the weeds on the question of Lenin's Hegelianism versus Raya Dostoevskaya's Hegelianism and how they're interrelated and how they might differ, is there a book that Raya Dostoevskaya wrote specifically on Hegel that might address that?
Well, actually, Philosophy and Revolution, she has a whole chapter, she has a whole section on why Hegel, why now. It starts with her own posture vis-a-vis Hegel, and chapter 2 is on Marx and his posture vis-a-vis Hegel, and chapter 3 is on Lenin. And she has very little criticism there, mostly on Lenin's philosophic ambivalence. And it's but that becomes much more developed in her later work, especially a work on women's liberation, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation, and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution, where she puts Lenin squarely in the realm of post-Marx Marxism, which she thought was a pejorative when it came to organization, and that he developed a lot on making concrete Hegel's dialectic for revolution, but when it came to organization, he didn't. He stuck with the old. He stuck with the party and the small, thin layer of Bolsheviks, and she goes into that somewhat. If you wanted a kind of a short version of that, one of the last points she makes that is so poignant is she goes into how important Critique of the Gotha program was for state and revolution. But Lenin at the same time doesn't say a word about organization, and yet that was Marx's most directly organizational document.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's jump into your article on the Ukraine. And to me, as I read this article, it seemed to me that the primary stance that you were taking is that this should be read as a critique of what might be called the anti-imperialist left, although that's perhaps more charitable perhaps than it ought to be, because there's more forms of anti-imperialism than just the one that you articulate and criticize here. The idea that Putin actions could be interpreted as a way of breaking with the hegemonic imperial order from the United States and setting up a multipolar world, and that we should support the challenges to U.S. imperialism on that basis. That's an anti-imperialist position on the left in the United States, and I think around the world, and that you're taking issue with in this piece, which I have also taken issue with, but on my through interviews. But what I would want to ask you though is whether or not there's a danger in ignoring some truths that come from that anti-imperialist position, even as we critique them. I mean, because, for instance, you said that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was totally unprovoked, and at the very start, and I feel as though that's not accurate. That there was a provocation, the continued reluctance from the Biden administration and previous administrations to make it clear whether or not Ukraine would be a NATO nation, to the degree to which the United States was arming Ukraine before the invasion, and the feeling that NATO was pressing up against the border of Russia and was challenging Russian power in that region, not just military power, but also in terms of mobility and access to trade routes and so on. That all those things amount to a provocation, whether or not that provocation doesn't justify what was an illegal invasion, but nonetheless it happened, right?
So if I can jump in just for a second, I know I didn't write the lead, but I do want to weigh in on this question of campism. Somehow there is U.S., there is Russia, and the two have spheres of interest, and entirety of global politics is viewed through the lens of competition between superpowers. That's how reality presents itself to the kind of imperialist point of view that you're speaking about. And the reason I strongly object to limiting our view to this particular focus is that Putin's first enemy is not NATO or United States or anyone else outside of Russia. His main enemy is inability to contain the dissatisfaction within Russia. It is Russians' dissatisfaction with their lives, which are not free, that is Putin's enemy. Putin has been turning to external wars as a means of suppressing dissent within. And this is true of every ruler in every age. It's across ages, it's across political divides. It's not NATO that's threatening Putin, it's his own people. And he needs this distraction, as he needed the war in Chechnya when he came to power, as he witnessed in Syria supporting murderous Assad. All of those are his way of controlling his own population. So Putin's enemy is not NATO, although NATO, of course, can cause damage. I'm not trying to say that NATO is faultless,
right.
But Putin's real enemy is dissent within Russia. That's who he is fighting.
Yeah, and the posture that I take, and I think is well grounded in the Leninist left, if you follow Lenin, is that peoples everywhere have a right to their own national self-determination, and the whatever one thinks of what's going on in Ukraine, that Russia was not threatened by Ukraine at all, and they are the ones who were telling the world, in my view, that, gee, you don't have to fall into this abyss of Russian totalitarianism. And Russia's equating the very word Ukraine with Nazi, the need to erase the very idea of Ukraine, which is an idea that's multinational, that's Jewish, that's Russian, that's multilingual, a country that has its own national self-identity, that never wanted to be a part of Russia directly. And it was always Lenin's principle that if these nations want to go their own way, they have an absolute right to. But that principle of national self-determination, especially at this moment, to me has become a beacon that you don't have to fall into this narrow nationalism and fascism and the universal devolvement of capitalism into those forms. And if anything, it wasn't NATO that rushed to their defense. If anything, they were telling Zelensky, get out, you don't have a chance. And everyone expected the Russian army was going to come in and do a quick work of wiping this thing up. It's only after they saw the absolute near 100% unity of the Ukrainian people, Russian, Jews, and Ukrainians, organizing themselves in such creative manners in all manners of life and distribution of things and medical care, and just putting up such a deep resistance. Suddenly it said, well, and all the demonstrations all over the world support Ukraine's. And suddenly some of these countries got a spine and said, we're going to send them some help to, and it's always been creeping in. The more the resistance deepens, the more the help came in. And it's true that NATO is doing that for its own reason, NATO as the leaders, but they weren't the leaders in this, they're the followers. The Germans, who would have thought that they would even consider cutting off the oil?
And you think they were motivated to do that because of popular pressure, not pressure from the United States?
I think it is. I think it's so. Putin is such an international pariah. You only got a couple countries to vote with him, like Iran and Syria and North Korea, I think. But they either abstained or they voted overwhelmingly that this cannot be. And it wasn't, I don't think that reflected, it's not the nations or the leaders, it reflected that this was such a horror that was being visited on the Ukrainian people, and their resistance, they're telling the world that we don't have to go in this direction. We, in this case, being the world, doesn't have to go in the direction of this fall into fascism. I mean, our country can fall into this stuff too. The right in our country got a lot more, the ultra-right fascist right, the neo-fascists, that supported Trump were huge. And, the fascists, and they had an election in Ukraine, they got about 2%. There are some Nazis in Ukraine, but they're not like, it's not like here.
Well, I want to go back to something that Urszula said, because the difficulty with having a conversation about this is, for me, is keeping track of all the facts on the ground. And sometimes I need to, go slowly through those facts on the ground. But the one question that came to mind as Urszula spoke about Putin's primary enemies being his own people, I believe that is the case. But the question is the character of that threat from my perspective, because, well, just being a U.S. citizen and seeing the way people in the dissatisfaction in the United States organizes itself and is organized politically, the way in which leaders are threatened politically and in other ways from the mass of society, civil society. It's not clear to me that when, for instance, when the uprisings happened in 2020 in response to the police violence in the United States, that the threat to the Trump administration represented that as that was organized into a threat against the Trump administration, that it also was organized into something that could truly liberate the people, so that their interests could be finally addressed. That what it seemed to me to happen in that instance was that the power of the people was diffuse and unorganized and chaotic in the streets, and that it was to the extent that it did something politically, it may have helped the Democratic Party, but it didn't help the people organize themselves into a real political threat. The same is true, in Canada, when the truckers organized against the vaccine mandate and against state power there. That clearly, while the dissatisfaction was real, the way in which it was organized was ultimately in favor of the Conservatives in Canada. And there was the threat to Trudeau, which didn't represent a threat from some new political force for socialism. So I just wonder, without knowing, to what degree is there actually a living socialist political force that is organizing the people's misery into and dissatisfaction into a threat that is more than a threat to the power of this particular elite, just to Putin, but to the entire order? That's my question. That's sort of rhetorical, but it's also not, because I don't know all the facts on the ground regarding Russian dissidents.
Well, that's the question that actually is very much on the agenda. Everyone, right and left, knows that the current state of affairs cannot continue. It's not stable. It's driving us over the edge. So when it falls apart, how it falls apart, what's going to replace it? There is a great deal, especially from the conservatives, saying, okay, we want to go back to, for Trump, make America great again. For Putin, reestablish Tsarist Empire. For Erdogan, reestablish the Ottoman Empire. Look back and try to regain the glory of whatever was in the past. Unfortunately, some Marxists are not too far behind. Let's get the primitive communism or something.
I don't put that in the same category. But yeah.
Well, you can't, and that's for me. This is what Marxism is saying. You cannot look to the past. We have to learn from the present about how to overcome it and what comes next. How is that going to be different? It can't be just that, okay, the war is coming. It's going to be bloody, and I'm going to get my gun so I can defend myself and my family. That's what the right offers. And it's compelling because the world is falling apart. So I fully understand why people are saying defense of my family comes first. But defense of my family at the cost of throwing away lives of many other families, that's not okay. That's not acceptable. So it is a much harder challenge to take up what is post-capitalism. If we have a revolution, what will be different? And it can't be just that if you put me in power, I will distribute things more equitably, because that has been tried several times in the last century and has proven not to be adequate, not to work. This is Russian Revolution and every other revolution that happened since. So what will be different? What kind of society will have learned from this human development through capitalism to get to post-capitalism? What does post-capitalism mean? That's the question that's on the agenda. That's what I hear in the question that you're asking, is where is this organizing idea that can help people develop into a sense of a we that is not me and my family, but we as the whole human family.
Right. So I think as we look at the situation in Ukraine, one of the tricks is going to be to try to be internationalist and to create a we that truly does cross boundaries between not only the working class people in the United States and Ukraine, but also between the working class in Ukraine and Russia, and working class in the United States and Russia and so on. Like finding a common political task in this moment without being shunted off into national interests. And it's difficult to say that right now, because part of, I think it's at least, there's an argument to be made that it's in the interest of the U.S. working class and the Russian working class for the Ukrainian working class to have their nation, to have national sovereignty, to be able to be empowered to develop a bourgeois state in that region, because, as long as things are run and, by oligarchs and totally corruptly and without any kind of democratic representation, the chances for a working class politics to develop in Ukraine is minimal. So there's that argument in support of the Ukrainian resistance, and just from the point of view of the totality, not just from the point of view of the humanitarian, the outrage and the moral outrage that goes into it as well. But I worry right now that by continuing that Biden's call for regime change in Russia, the call to get rid of Putin, might be helped along by people who are taking the stance that you're taking in this article about Putin's brutal war, that there are things that are happening that are being perpetrated by the U.S. state, by NATO, by Europe, which ought to concern all working class people. The power in which they're exercising over the banks to turn the financial sector into a weapon against the people in Russia. We might want to counter that. I think what's in the best interest of everyone is a peaceful, negotiated settlement of the conflict rather than a continuation of a long-term resistance and the spilling out over years of this conflict. Because just as just as Russia and Putin rely on the construction of outside enemies in order to squelch internal dissent, the same's true for us here. So how do you think, navigate the need to stand up for the more progressive elements in that region to defend the Ukrainians' right to self-determination, and even to support the seemingly more progressive Zelensky as opposed to Putin, but without falling in lockstep with the Biden administration and a United States government that has had a long-standing imperial ambition to just be able to control who's in charge around the world and who will create utter chaos in the interest of holding on to their power.
The first thing we could say is that the invasion, if really helped the imperial ambitions of the U.S. NATO was indeed falling apart. NATO was not a unified system. The Germans and the French and different countries were more than willing to deal with Putin and to keep providing him with all the economic interchanges that he needed to keep his regime going. And NATO is now, not only is it unified, the countries that never dreamed of participating in something like this, like the Swiss, the Swedes, Finland, now want to join NATO. And none of this had to do with that these countries saw their interest in that direction before, but now they see that that they have to be part of this bloc, and so that's the first thing. It wasn't NATO that got together and suddenly became this counterforce. It was Putin who created that counterforce because this behavior is so outrageous and so part of the historic memory of what Russian tanks coming in and crushing a population represent. And I think what the best way to think about it is that this is a global stage of state capitalism that is on the road to total destruction. In other words, what's the form it's taking in the U.S.? The one thing that united the whole gamut of bourgeois politicians was the military budget. They had a lot of fight about this and that and the other thing. Anything to do with poverty for children that had been helped by the initial relief package was thrown out the window. But COVID support, but there was hardly a blink about this $8 trillion, over 10-year defense budget that is reshaping the U.S. economy, bringing home things like chip making, struggle over how the next generation of the internet and all this is going to be done, because above all, we got to keep China out of this. The Chinese were way ahead in producing 5G, for example, and they're being taken out of that loop because the purpose of the internet, more than ever, and part of what the war is showing is you got to have smart weapons. I mean, smart weapons are the currency. Now, when capitalism has come into such total crises, the drift into this other hating and fascism and militarism is threatening all of us. And that's where we have to really show that the absolute of our era under capitalism is absolute destruction, whether it's war or depression or climate. And I think in some ways, the youth like Greta Thunberg and the youth in Africa that are part of the Fridays for the future movement are way ahead of us. And one of the last things she said was, all political and economic systems have failed us. Only humanity hasn't yet failed us. So it's that kind of sensibility that is emerging that needs a voice, a philosophic voice.
Well, I feel as though, just on that last point, that unfortunately the systems of economics and of politics are human systems. We don't know. They seem not to be. We're alienated from them, but we have to take responsibility for them. So if things keep going the way they're going, humanity will have failed itself and failed to liberate itself. But the problem here is that it's very difficult. In fact, and from a particular point of view, it may be impossible to find the right side to take in this conflict. Like the obviously, the Russian invasion is illegal. A Putin victory and a breakup of U.S. hegemony would hardly be some victory for humanity. It would just be the escalation of tension and probably violence between the major powers in the world, which would really be Europe, United States, and China eventually, rather than Russia, but Russia as well. Actually, we shouldn't ignore the fact that Russia walked into this war using the threat of tactical nuclear weapons from the outset, and that continues to be in the background. And when when we think about the Ukrainian resistance, it's very difficult for me anyway to not think about the Cold War and the kind of doomsday scenario that was constantly on the news and in my own mind in the 80s, where you had there was a animated cartoon called The Winds of War. I think no, that wasn't what it was called, but it was this British cartoon about an older couple surviving the first nuclear attack and then slowly dying, and the news at the beginning of that comic sort of sounds like the news today. Like it seems to me conceivable that we could be headed for World War III, that we could actually finally see that doomsday that we were, promised in a horrible way back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And again, that makes me think that we need a peace movement. An international peace movement to force all factions to negotiate some sort of withdrawal and settlement. What do you think?
I wouldn't consider the Ukrainian people a faction in this case. I mean, they're fighting for their lives to not fall into that abyss that's the future of all of us, frankly. And I wouldn't consider them a faction, and their self-defense.
Wait. But if Zelensky negotiates a peaceful withdrawal of Russian forces from portions of Ukraine, and allows him to occupy the Donbass region, and that would not that means the majority of Ukrainians would no longer have to fight for their lives. And there are factions here, in so much as like there's the Ukrainian government. And there's the Russian government. There are military forces. There are arms coming from NATO and Europe. I mean, these power bases exist, and the people are caught in the middle. And they're fighting for their lives. But if they was a peaceful negotiation between the factions, they wouldn't have to fight. At least that's the idea. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But how? I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around what you're saying, because when Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, Russia guaranteed that they would not attack Ukraine. They took Ukraine, surrendered their nuclear weapons precisely to avoid a nuclear war, and were guaranteed that their sovereignty would be protected. And of course,
but you can never. There's no guarantees.
So how could you possibly believe that any peace negotiation that would say Russia can then take Donbass and then the rest of us are going to go about our lives? That's a complete non sequitur. That it's already proven that this is not going to hold up. first of all, Russia has no intention of giving up their territorial claim to all of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So that in some ways
Russia.
is not, Putin, that's a non-starter. But even if somehow Russia was forced into signing such a treaty, it would be just like U.S.'s treaties with Native Americans. They're not worth the paper they're written on.
So what you're saying is that only recourse then is to defeat the Russians militarily and risk, the escalation of the conflict into a nuclear exchange, which Russia has said that Putin has said he's willing to do. That as part of their military strategy, the use of small-scale nuclear weapons, which, if used, would certainly unleash retaliation. So there is no way under bourgeois society with Putin in place for there to be a peaceful withdrawal and a negotiated settlement.
Well, it's up to the Ukrainians. I mean, if Zelensky really plays it according to what he's saying, and if they vote for something like that, I doubt that they will. I mean, the genocidal propaganda coming out of Russia now, that and after all the revelations of the mass murders that in the suburbs around Ukraine, and Putin calling them war heroes, the people who carried these things out, and the wholesale just the turning Mariupol into rubble and all these different towns that one after another, seeing what happened. It's just a manifestation of his of this total genocidal ideology that is he's wreaking on the Ukrainians. And if they agree to something, like Finland agreed to the Finlandization when they defeated Stalin's Russia, that would be okay. I mean, the Ukrainians have already said that we don't necessarily want to join NATO. We just want to have a guarantee for our own self-defense, our own defense of our country, and our own ability to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. But I'm not saying I'm this wholesale against that. But I think that what Marxists need to say in this moment is that the opposite of this permanent war, which we're involved in right now, and one form of war or another, is permanent revolution. It's seeing the development of the self-organization of masses and their own defense and their own capacity to organize their lives together and against this as something that is the determinant, not just for a bourgeois state, but for everyday life. Marx's revolution and permanence is being lost in all this. His idea that freedom and democracy cannot just stop at the bourgeois state. It has to deepen and become inextricably part of everyday life activity, and his concept of freedom, which begins from the capacity to make an object out of and freely determine that life activity. That's his concept of labor, that is not labor in any narrow sense that usually the left gloms onto, but is labor in the sense of human life activity that is multidimensional from the start and is an opening to the new. And our age of absolutes demands that kind of opening to a new sense of reality, a sense that we're part of nature and its nature speaking for itself when humanity isn't alienated from its own social life processes.
Okay, I have a question about NATO, and then I wanted to show you. Have you ever watched Zelensky's television program, Servant of the People?
Yeah.
We tried. It's really hard.
After the thing happened, it was on Netflix, and we tried watching it, but it was so painful to watch it, because of
the news every day.
The news every day, Yeah, you were going to make a point
Okay. My first question, though, before we get to watch, I want to show you guys the opening of the Servant of the People, and then ask a question about how we should feel about Ukraine as a place where there would be conditions for the development of a socialist politics, as a realm where where freedom might have been opening up. Where there might have been a change for the better. And so, but to start with, though, regarding NATO, for me, from my very, maybe provincial U.S.-centric perspective, the big question right now is, why the hell did Russia never join NATO? Well, how did we allow the conflict between Europe, the United States, and Russia to continue after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War? Why is it that there should be enough of a difference in outlook and interests between the Russian state, not the Russian people, but the Russian state and the European states, that this could erupt into violence and to the threat of nuclear exchanges and all of that, when there is no ideological difference? We're all supposed to be playing the same game of trade, buy and sell, trade, develop. Why is this happening? Why did Russia not get on board the militarized United Nations called NATO? And what do you think the answer to that is? Why weren't they allowed in either? I mean, it's not just that Russia wanted in at times. And so what do you think?
I think this militarized state capitalism has a life of its own. Like, I don't know if you remember when Gorbachev met with Reagan in Iceland, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was either Gorbachev or Reagan said, well, let's get rid of all these weapons. And Reagan said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. But, it was pulled back immediately. These are too precious. This military, what's been called military industrial complex is so much a part and parcel of American capitalism that, no, you can't do that. That's the guardian of preserving capital relations, as it still is. That's American state capitalism was grounded on, beginning out of the Cold War, was on this tremendous expansion, military expansion, that then the Russians had to create their own bomb after the U.S. was the only one to have the bomb, and that's the ultimate currency. And the moment that Gorbachev was offering, let's get rid of them all, it was either Gorbachev or Reagan, I can't remember. The leaders that be, immediately pulled back from any such notion that this is not going to happen. We're not going to get rid of nuclear weapons.
And the other answer is that there is no alliance of bourgeois nations that is possibly a solution. Even if there was a UN that encompassed absolutely everybody, it's a thieves' kitchen. Hussein was U.S.'s creation. And when it was expedient for U.S. to turn against him, they did. Noriega was U.S.'s creation. There were no differences. And when it was expedient for U.S. to turn against him, they did. So none of these pacts, none of these peace promises is worth anything. From where I'm sitting, they're going to turn against each other at one point, and there is no saying who is going to stab whom in the back first.
Yeah, that's one of the things I take up in the article is that this moment is a changed world, and I think everyone grasps that. But it's a changed world in two senses. One is that the Ukrainians are telling the world, you don't have to fall into this abyss.
Mm.
And the other is a changed world of alliances. And we don't know, who's going to fall on what side. Even NATO, even Western Europe today still has very deep differences. The guy in Hungary with Orban, yeah, he still doesn't want to give up the Russian oil, and he's backing away from his initial, support of all this. Russian tanks coming in to crush a population and uprising is just too powerful an image in Hungary. I can assure you of that. Mm-hmm. But what it shows me is that it's part of global capitalism in crisis, that there's all these different alliances and different shakeups that happened in the build up to World War II. Like we started up talking about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and you don't know until the shooting starts who's going to betray who, or even after the shooting starts. When Hitler turned on Stalin couldn't believe it.
He was shocked.
He was shocked. All the stuff coming out of the archives. He was up at his dacha, and they came to visit him, and he thought they were going to have his head, because he kept saying, "Oh, this will never happen." He had never prepared, for this turn of events. So solid was his concept of an affinity with Hitler, and there was a line that said, I think the generals were saying, we have to prepare for that. We have to mobilize the people, and we have to do something about this. And Stalin says, well, who do you think should lead this? And
because he thought he was going to get taking to execute it.
And Beria says, why, you, of course, Comrade Stalin. The first guy they got rid of when Stalin died. But that's part of what I think so many people are living through, if I may explicate a little bit, that so many pundits and commentaries know that this is such a totally dangerous period. The rate of accumulation has collapsed in a way that like people like Simon Kuznets had discovered, in the build-up to World War II, and questioned that everything goes bad in this transition because the whole structure of the system is built to not have a way out of this collapsed accumulation. And the only thing more dangerous than globalization is deglobalization on a capitalist ground. Mm-hmm. Deglobalization on a capitalist ground means that all these countries are turning to narrow nationalism and fascism and other hating and militarization. And there's so many pundits, bourgeois pundits, that are reliving this kind of moment. And part of what really stood out for, I think, in Europe was we're back to something that we haven't seen since World War II. And the memories of that moment are still so much etched in European history. And you don't know right till the end who's going to be on what side. The alliances are up for grabs. The Chinese are hedging their bets after saying we have the deepest friendship ever. Suddenly, they don't know what exactly they should do. And a lot of other countries are hedging their bets. And there's no...
Well, okay, so I want to respond to everything you just said, maybe with what will appear like a non sequitur, but I hope that it isn't ultimately a non sequitur. By showing you this, just the opening segment here of Zelensky is servant of the people, and then asking a follow up to it. So let's see how this works.
Okay.
So here
Gotta
it
watch this closely.
Oh, didn't mean to do that.
Я люблю свою страну, люблю свою жену, люблю свою собаку. Я всего на свете член, почти что супермен, но редко лезу в драку. Знает весь двор мой приговор, слуга народа. У меня почти все есть, достоинство и честь, и даже крики «Браво!». Персональный самолет мне выделил народ, а что, имею право на животу. Вот тут набью тату, слуга народа.
Слава народу.
So I don't know if you recognize the images that he walks past as he goes to his office there in the government, but I spent like an hour once slowly going through each part, looking up the images, and now I don't remember them all, but this progression of history from the kind of the bringing of Christianity to the Ukraine, to the bringing of trade, and then the parliament, and then the people and uprising, and then the establishment of the bourgeois state at the end, right? And which is he's walking into. And the fact is, in Ukraine, they're not there yet. They were not even at that level where they had anything like even formal freedoms like the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States. And that's what Zelensky was ultimately promising to be able to establish. So, when I watched that, I was propagandized for Zelensky, right? As a socialist, I was like, oh yeah, this is my man. And then I looked into the reality, right? And Zelensky was funded by an oligarch even in those days. And Zelensky is as torn by multiple interests that have formed, since the 19th century, when that bourgeois promise seemed more real than it does now. And one of those influences on the project of creating the Ukrainian bourgeois state, it was the West, was the United States and NATO, and the way that those interests, I think, brought Ukraine into a conflict that really had nothing to do with the Ukrainian people. Ultimately, I mean, you pointed out in your article that Zelensky is Jewish and that his native language is Russian. The idea that Ukraine is about some distinct ethnicity from the Russian people is wrongheaded. There's a place called Ukraine. They speak Russian. They speak Ukrainian. They have their own society. So it's very sad, first of all, for me to see this happening, just in terms of the Ukrainian project. But for us, living in the United States, living in Europe, living, who knows where in the world where there are more formal freedoms, aren't we tasked, or isn't it us that we're really tasked with leading some sort of socialist change rather than the Ukrainians, who, after all, had not even arrived at the bourgeois revolution yet?
So have you heard any of the statements from Ukrainian leftists?
No, tell me what they say.
Well,
What would they say in response to that question?
What they say is, yes, we need to defeat Russians, and we are joining the resistance to defeat this invasion. But should we win, and we fight to win, should we win, we're never going to settle for Zelensky and the kind of state he represents. That's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting against the invasion, and we're with whoever is fighting with us, including Zelensky and NATO and whoever. But when we want to establish the society we want to establish, it's not going to be a bourgeois state. And they have a very, depending on who you read, there are several different statements, but they have a vision of a genuinely socialist Ukraine to be established after the war. They're laughing, absolutely laughing at Zelensky's promise that after the war, he's going to provide housing for government workers. And they're saying, what is that? Everyone deserves housing. Everyone has to be housed. It's not just government.
How about the right to form a socialist party in Ukraine, which he's taken away recently?
Right. So the Ukrainian left itself is not going to be happy with Zelensky and the kind of society that he represents.
Mm-hmm. And my own view is that if there is a victory, the victory will be so clearly not the victory of the state machinery, but it'd be the victory of the solidarity, social solidarity of the mass of Ukrainians, that it will have some kind of implications about the future and decisions about the future that go beyond the oligarchs they're all out of the country and they're saving their ass, but there's going to be there certainly will be the same political, economic compulsion from the West to develop in a certain way. But I think that's where the whole philosophy of revolution and permanence comes. And I agree with you that our responsibility is to try to fight here, fight everywhere, fight on all these grounds as we express our solidarity with Ukrainians and the new kind of opening that they might create for everyone.
Well, final question. When it comes to, you asked earlier, how can we trust Putin? How can we trust the Russian state to be true to its word in a peaceful negotiation? And the treaties wouldn't be worth the paper they were signed on. Basically was your sentiment. And I guess the only answer to that would be it would be pressure from a more organized Russian people that would keep Putin in line, and from a United States and European left and Ukrainian left that could bring a force together so that there would be consequences for these politicians and for this bourgeois states if they weren't able to hold on to peace. That the idea that the people of the world should have to be put at existential risk because of the conflicts between these, the oligarchs and banks and, politicians, is just unacceptable. And if we could organize on that basis, perhaps we could enforce a peaceful negotiated settlement and get some formal freedoms in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't think we know the end of what's going to happen within Russia itself and the depth of the disaffection within the army itself. The fog of war, it's hard to get these stories out, but when I read a lot of the accounts, Daily Kos has somehow they put together so many different accounts of these different incidences and activities. You see such a sense among the Russian soldiers, they don't want to be there. And some of them are even turning over their tanks to the Ukrainians, and the ones that do stay and that do commit these atrocities are so become so inhuman. But the ordinary Russian soldiers don't want to be there, and the truth of the war is coming home, and we don't know what kind of impact that's going to have. It's kind of on the level of the depth of opposition to the Vietnam War, which was much more open here because we didn't have a totalitarian state that would put you in jail for 15 years for calling it a war, which yet. But we don't know what's going to come of this. We don't know what ramifications are going to come out of this. And it's the point is to support the two worlds in every country, support that world that is fighting for freedom in their everyday life and striving for a way out of this total existential crisis. That's the word of the last decade. Everything's an existential crisis. Our democracy is in an existential crisis. The planet is in an existential crisis. And it's all true. And it just means that the totality of capitalism is threatening humanity.
And all life.
And that's why the Marxist philosophic perspective is so precious for this moment.
Yeah. Listen, we've been talking for about an hour and 5 minutes. I want to take a break. It was longer than the 45 minutes I said we'd talk for. Well, I want to take a break and go get some coffee. No, it's fine. It's not your fault. It has been a great conversation. I'm gonna so I'm just gonna end this stream on Twitch. When I send you another link, I'm gonna get some coffee. When I get my coffee and I send you another link, it will just be for a video that we will release only for patrons later.
All right.
And what I want to talk about with you on the second stream is just what, if we can think in a practical terms for a minute, what it would look like to have the kind of international socialist politics that would be necessary to truly intervene in a moment like this one. And what do you think we should be building along those lines? And so that's what we'll talk about for patrons, for the inside vanguardist cell that that I'm creating. All right.